going to be a tough one to follow. Excellent job, Tony. Prepared to be disappointed after that. It's been a few weeks ago in the teenager class. I think it may have been Sawyer. He asked me, where did the Old Testament come from? And the easy answer and the right answer comes from God. And that's, I got the sense that they wanted something a little bit more detailed than that, because we'd been studying some books of the New Testament, and we had made some references to the canon and to the development of those books and the letters that the apostles had written. But when you look back at the Old Testament and you start looking at the physical book, how it survived, how we got it, it's a lot more complicated. And just to prepare you all, there's a lot of big words in this, and I'm sure I'll mess them up. So Jeff or John or Nolan, if I mispronounce something, feel free to shout out the correct pronunciation of the word. So I did some research and study, and to begin with the development of the Old Testament, you kind of had to go back to the development, maybe the beginning of writing itself, not in a biblical sense, but in a secular sense. And what I've read, and I think most scholars agreed that actual writing started around 3000 BC. So that's 5,000 years ago. Numbers and distinct marks and things that meant something went back further, but for somebody to write something down on a piece of wood or a piece of clay or on a rock, and then next week, next month, next year, somebody be able to read that and understand that, experts felt 3000 BC, 3200 BC was about when that form of language was written down. So as we know, Moses is credited for the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Moses started writing around 1500 BC. So 1500 years later, Moses is there writing these books called the Law. The Hebrews refer to it as the Torah, which is the first 5 books of what we call the Old Testament. So obviously a lot had advanced over those 1500 years, and I didn't read this, but I think I've heard this before, and I'm sure I didn't think of it on my own. But Moses was uniquely prepared to write. He became an Egyptian, raised in the Pharaoh's house, would have been exposed to probably one of the better educations of that time, being raised in those circumstances. And Moses was there for a long time in Egypt as an Egyptian in the house of Pharaoh. I think he was almost 40 or at 40 before he left out of there. So he would have been educated in math and science, certainly reading and writing. So just from a personal perspective, Moses was an educated man. So here we have God giving him the 10 Commandments, and that's really what we think about, those 10 Commandments written in stone. And as we go back to these early writings, that's one thing that I found interesting, is the Bible, the Old Testament talks about stone, it talks about clay, it talks about wood, it talks about papyrus. And if you look at secular history and archaeological finds, they kind of mimic those biblical writing surfaces, from stone to wood to clay. So that was interesting in and of itself. But the way that, on a high level here, and let me sidebar here real quick, you can spend oodles and oodles of time on the development of the Old Testament. And there's lots of theories. There's lots of people that weigh in on that. And we'll touch a little bit on that. I'm not going to dive into those things. We could probably get John Bailiff to spend a year of Wednesday evenings talking about some of this stuff. Pretty interesting, or at least I think it is. And consequently, if you see the teens starting to nod off, go ahead and let them sleep. They've heard me talk about this for 2 or 3 weeks now, so it's all right if they miss some of this. So we have the first 5 books. Moses wrote those books. There's one sidebar toward the end when Moses dies and he's buried. Who wrote that? That's kind of a rabbit hole you can chase there. But I think there's Jewish tradition, and I think there's some reference in the Old Testament itself, maybe even the New Testament, that those 5 books, they were written. I don't know if they were written on animal skin. Part of it, we know the 10 Commandments was on stone, but they were kept in the Ark of the Covenant. And then as the years go by, and you have Joshua, and you have Dan, you have the minor prophets, and the former prophets, David, Solomon, they add to this book that we call the Old Testament. And things happened. The temple was destroyed. The children of Israel was taken into Babylonian captivity and come back. And there's some inferences in the Old Testament, and there's also some Jewish traditions that Ezra and Nehemiah are credited with kind of gathering these books and forming what we now have as the Old Testament. Gathering back together, kept them in the temple. I think maybe there was a library in the temple. Not sure about that. But that's the physicality, I guess, the development of the books of the Old Testament at a very, very high level, and I hope without too many errors. And then some interesting things happened that we hear about, and some interesting words that we've heard mentioned. I guess the first point I should make, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, I think is the pronunciation as they call that, had 24 books. How many books do we have in our Old Testament? What's the number?
36, 29.
All right. So we got some different answers. But 39 Old Testament books. The Tanakh, the original Hebrew, had 24. And the reason for that is the way they formulated their books. We have a 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. They had Kings and Samuel. And then another big difference, a big number, is the minor prophets. How many do we have? I believe it's 12 minor prophets. In the original Hebrew Tanakh, they counted that as one book. So that's why there's a difference in number. Same material, but a different number. And most scholars believe that the Hebrew canon, the inspired Word of God, the canon, the Old Testament we would call it, was completed around 400 BC. That's when we had the Bible. So obviously Jesus and the apostles, that book had been around for a long time when they began their ministry and their teachings, and would have been very familiar with that book. And then there's a little side road here. A guy named Alexander the Great showed up on the scene and pretty much took control of what was known as the better part of the known world at that time. And he spoke Greek, and Greek became a really, really common language in that 200 BC, 100 BC, even up into Jesus' time and the apostles. Greek was a very common tongue for a while. So, and again, the dates, I'm sure these are debated, but around 200, 250 BC, they translated this Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, into a Greek version. So people that spoke the Greek dialect and read in Greek could read the Old Testament. They call that the Septuagint, I believe is the right word. So you got the Tanakh, Hebrew Bible, 24 books, and you've got the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation. And here's where things start to get interesting. Alphabets are different. I think the Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters. I don't think they may not have any vowels, or they certainly have less vowels. So when you start translating this stuff, words get changed a little bit, and then debates start to happen. And the Septuagint has some 14 books and again, here's another word, apocryphy. Is that right? Am I close? Apocrypha books, apocryphy books that are not in our Old Testament. And there's a lot of debate and argument about that, and it goes back and forth. The Catholics have some of those books in their Bible, in their Old Testament. Eastern Orthodox has more of those books, and there's books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Esdra, the book of Judith. There's 14 of them, like Words of Wisdom, written by Solomon. And there's a lot of debate as when those books were actually written. Were they actually inspired by God? And that's a whole other series of lessons there that we could have. I remember several years ago, Mike Smith did a Wednesday evening class about the canon and about these books. It was very interesting. So we've got the Tanakh, the original Old Testament Bible, what we would call it, 24 books. We have the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of that. And then we have this Masoretic text, which the Masorai, Jewish scribes, and over a period of 500 years from about AD, again, now we're 500, 400 years after the Christ of death to around 1000 AD, they kind of went through this painstakingly, letter by letter, and really, decided which books belonged in the Old Testament. That's probably not a real correct statement, but at a high level. But it's really the basis for the Old Testament that we have today, of the 39 books that we read in the Old Testament. So that's what we've been studying a little bit in the teen class, and I felt that it might be an interesting topic, and it doesn't look like anybody fell asleep. So thank you for your kind attention. Next.